Cool. All right, well, let's look at the Bible. We're going to spend a few moments looking at the Bible now. We believe that this is a large part of how God makes us people who are courageous in mission, Bible-saturated, Spirit-dependent and loving of others. And we've started a series of talks looking at spiritual disciplines. That's things we can do that bring us closer to God. Things we can do that bring us closer to God. And they're going to range everything from prayer and obvious ones all the way through to celebration and meeting together with other people. And over the course of the next couple of months, we come to think about how we use our money and that kind of thing. These are all different practical ways that we can come closer to God. And today, I want to think of one that is a little bit unusual in our culture. It's not one that I've ever heard addressed directly in church before, but I think is actually really powerful and helpful. And that's solitude and silence. The discipline of solitude and silence. Here's my lunchtime summary. Solitude and silence are a way of reconnecting with God and finding peace and healing for fractured souls. Solitude and silence are a way of reconnecting with God and finding peace and healing for our fractured souls. Hopefully you're getting the sense of two directions there, that actually something happens when we actively pursue solitude and silence that isn't just about, that works both upwards, reconnects us with God, but also brings something of healing to us. Solitude and silence are a way of reconnecting with God and finding peace and healing for our fractured souls. So, we're going to read the Bible. Would you turn to 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 9. What page is that? Well, the first person to find it gets a prize, as ever. 360, Rosemary. Well done. 1 Kings 19 and verses 9 to 12. I've always wondered what your singing voice sounds like, Rosemary, so that's great. If you're a guest, that's a running joke that I get the person who finds the Bible reading to sing the last song. Don't worry, it doesn't really happen. Yet. So this is a story about Elijah, who was a prophet in the Old Testament. And the word of God, the Lord came to him, that's to Elijah. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty." Zealous, if you're not a native English speaker, and I know that we sometimes have non-native English speakers with us. Zealous means really enthusiastic, committed to something, that you take it extremely seriously. And you do all you can to make it happen. Zealous for the Lord God Almighty. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of a cave. It's worth carrying on and reading the rest of the chapter. We're not going to do that now because we don't have time, but and reading what God says to him and how he deals with Elijah, which is what we're going to think about a bit now. The idea of deliberately practicing solitude and silence is one that's begun to receive a lot of attention in particularly spiritual writing, but also other types of writing in the last few years. It responds to a problem that I think has always been there, but has got worse over recent decades, exponentially worse. Right? That means worse at a rate that's getting ever and ever and ever more worse. As the world has got busier, more connected, more distracted and more filled with noise, the problems that those things give or generate have become more and more profound. It might be that this sermon doesn't speak to you at all, in which case, thanks for being here. It's great to have you with us. You're encouraging us just by being present. and the Lord is faithful. But it speaks to me quite profoundly, and so I wonder whether it might speak to others as well. I don't know if you've ever experienced a season or a time in life when materially you have everything you need, you're successful. Yet inside you find that you're still hungry for something more. You can be someone who has an outward drive and is busy and has a full life, and yet inwardly feels chaotic, longing for rest, and quite empty. Many long for peace, but internally feel anything but. I would say if you're someone who is a deep person of faith, that this experience can also bring with it a sense of guilt. Surely I shouldn't feel like this, because after all, Jesus is supposed to be the answer. And he is the answer to so many things. But yet we still can feel this way. Over time, it builds up until the point where you become angry with other people. I wonder how often parents snapping at children are a symptom of this. And then eventually angry with God. Actually, I wonder if you noticed that dynamic in the Mary and Martha story we read earlier in the Gospel reading. That Martha is busy and busy and busy and busy. She's annoyed at her sister, and then she's annoyed with Jesus himself. The roots of this are deep. The disconnect between the outward control that we work really hard for and the inward distress we experience are profoundly and ultimately theological. That is, they have their cause in the relationship between human beings and God. When humanity, I'm going to summarize an enormous amount of teaching now. When humanity turned its back on God to seek to take God's place, something broke inside us. That's what the stories of Genesis 1 to 3 and so on are trying to teach. They're teaching fundamental truths about who humanity is. Right? That we try and take God's place. We eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's essentially saying we want to be in God's place on our own time and in our own way to be on his throne. And when that happens, the world breaks. Our world breaks. And it breaks in three directions. It breaks between us and God. So you see in the story of Adam and Eve, the first thing they do is hide. Why is that there? Well, Moses, the writer of Genesis, and the writers who've helped him to shape that, are trying to communicate that when human beings turn their back on God, the first thing that happens is that their relationship with him breaks, and they start to hide from him. The second thing that breaks is their relationship with each other. They start to turn on one another. So the first thing Adam and Eve say is, it wasn't my fault, it was them. But actually, subtly, the third direction that we begin to see human beings breaking when we turn our backs on God is internal. It's inside us. You start to see some of that picked out in the way that God responds and points out the consequences of that. Now, we call this, there's a word for this, it's called sin, right? Sin doesn't primarily mean the things that we do wrong, stealing, lying, and so on. Although it does include those things. Primarily, sin means the condition that makes us do it. Right? Why is it that I am someone who gets angry with my wife? It's because of sin. It's like a disease that affects us. It affects everybody. There's something profoundly broken. And it needs to be repaired. And that's what coming to Jesus is all about. It's about healing our souls, right? Receiving forgiveness, pardon for the things we've done wrong, but also healing. It's like going to a doctor to get yourself fixed. And yet I think sometimes we can avoid having that internal bit fixed. We're quick to, if we're zealous for God, we're quick to try and fix the external bits. We go to church, we pray, we want to fix our relationship with Jesus. That's great. We try and fix our relationships with other people. So if you're stealing now, God's message to you this morning is don't steal. Right? But I think we get that, right? I become a Christian, I want to be a man of God, so I shouldn't cheat on my wife, right? I shouldn't, and so on. Obvious stuff. But I want to also see that third bit fixed, the bit that's inside. Because hiding ourselves from God becomes destructive. It makes us like boats that are on the sea. I was down in Brighton last night watching a jazz gig with my brother. It was great fun. The amazing thing about being on Brighton Pier, particularly at night times, is that the wind gets up. You see how powerful the sea is. And you can occasionally see little boats on the sea. And as the wind gets up, they crash up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And the only thing that's keeping them from being totally smashed up in this sea, and the motion of up and down and crashing getting worse and worse, is that they're tied to something. So they're tied to the shore. And yet, when we turn our backs on God, internally, what happens is we cut that tie. You're no longer attached to the pier. And that's fine, you can float around when the sea's calm, but over time it gets bigger and bigger, and the boat gets driven further and further and further from the shore, and waves are crashing harder and harder, and you think sooner or later this is going to break. And actually, we make it worse. We perpetuate it, because we respond in two ways. The first is to resolve to try harder and harder to control the world around us. Right? If you've ever been stressed and burnt out and feeling that kind of sense of emptiness or loneliness, the response often is just try harder to control your life. You grip the thing tighter. Actually, that's like doubling down in a casino. I'm already £300 down, but if I put another 300, I might win the first lot back. No, you won't. All you're going to do is lose bigger. And so we lose bigger and bigger and bigger. The second is to mask the problem. I think this is the most prevalent one. We mask the problem by distracting ourselves. We don't want to get quiet in our minds and our souls, because if we do, we have to confront the fact that we're broken there. But actually, that quietness is just another way, that distraction, and it can take loads of forms. It can take forms of endlessly seeing other people. It can take the form of TV. It could take the form of radio or podcasting, even of endlessly reading books. All these things can just be another way of hiding from God. And you're right back there in the garden with Adam and Eve, hiding behind a bush and saying, we didn't want to see you because we were ashamed. St. Augustine was fundamentally right. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. But that rest means stopping and coming out of hiding and facing God and ourselves. So how do we do this? Well, what is the answer? That's bleak, wasn't it? God, he normally tells jokes. I should have saved my Gabriel Jesus striker joke for the sermon. What's the answer? Well, actually, the Bible narrates the answer for us. Often the answer in the Bible isn't given in a kind of question and answer format, that you ask a question and you look up the answer. So you go, what's the answer to a turbulent and broken, fractured soul? And that sense of internal emptiness and kind of dis-peace. And it's page 363. You can turn it. There's the question and the answer. It doesn't do that. What it does is it tells us stories. Tells us stories that demonstrate the answer in practice. That's often demonstrate the problem in practice, and they demonstrate the answer in practice. That's what the Elijah story is doing, partly. In the reading we heard, Elijah is outwardly at the peak of his powers. If you don't know the story, Elijah wins an extraordinary victory. He's publicly probably the most powerful man in Israel and Judah and the surrounding regions at that time. He has been on the top of a mountain. That's where Israel conducts its kind of big public meetings. He's had a showdown with prophets through terrible religion where they were sacrificing kids and stuff, and he's humiliated them. And God has vindicated Elijah. Elijah has said there's going to be rain, so the economy is going to regenerate, and there's rain starting. He's told the king what to do. He's at the peak of his powers. Indeed, there probably isn't another prophet apart from Moses in the whole of the Old Testament who is as powerful as this man at this point, as successful as this man at this point. He becomes a picture of success, to the point where when John the Baptist comes, Jesus says, do you know Elijah? He's like Elijah. And everyone's like, oh, I get it. He's really important. He's really important. And yet, Elijah, outwardly triumphant, is inwardly broken, falling apart, racked with doubt. I mean, thought about that. This man has seen an amazing victory, miraculous victory, and he's there saying it's hopeless, you're never going to win. Racked with despair, with sentiments that are actually untrue, they're illogical, Right? So he says, I'm the only one left. I'm the only one who follows Yahweh in the whole of Israel. Actually, God shows him later there are thousands. But that's not how soul fracturing works, right? It makes us think stuff that are untrue. They point to something deep that's broken inside him. And what does God do? Well, he leads Elijah away from everybody else. He takes him into the desert, first of all, then up a mountain. Away from everyone. And then he shows him the fire and the wind and the noise. And God isn't in any of them. He's in the quiet. And God says to Elijah, you've just got to listen. Be quiet and listen. Reveals himself in the silence of a cave. Or what about Mary and Martha? Right, I picked that story for a reason, right? Because Martha is incredibly busy. It's a totally different scenario. She's not a prophet, conducting showdowns with the pagan prophets. She's someone who's really, really busy doing important work around the house, right? And in ministry, right? She's caring for Jesus. She's hosting Jesus. She's doing an amazing job. It's not easy to host Jesus, right? You read the stories of other people who've hosted Jesus. He's not an easy guest. But Martha's doing an awesome job. And inwardly, she's coming apart. She's working hard. She's being successful. She's busy. She's distracted. And she's broken. Even she's come to resent her sister. We've all had a sister like that. Or a brother like that. I mean, they're annoying, aren't they? I'm working hard and there you are slacking off. Right? And she's come to resent Jesus. Right? I get this done over with my kids. Bless them, I love them. Dad, he, she, they have had more screen time than me. Why don't you stop them? Right? They've been playing on the iPad for longer than I have. Okay? And the criticism there is, I'm irritated by them, they're having more iPad, but I'm also irritated by you because you're unfair. That's what Martha's saying to Jesus. Right? She's broken. So Jesus says, just stop and be quiet and listen. You see it over and over again in Jesus' own ministry, right? He goes into the desert to be alone. He goes off to be silent. One of the best explanations of what's going on here is found in Psalm 131, verses 1 to 2. It says, O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things that are too great and too marvellous for me, but I have calmed and weaned my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. I've resisted distractions. I'm not thinking about things that are too great for me. I've isolated myself from them. We might think of mobile phones or 24-hour news or social media. Then he calms and quiets his soul to be quiet. The Greek translation says that he's lifting up his soul to God as an offering. The answer is to start to practice this solitude and silence regularly. It's like having a tub full of river water, dirty river water. I remember being in a toddler group like Alison was talking about earlier, and by the way, a sing and dance. I'm not saying you should come along for that, but there's literal singing and dancing from a pastor every week. Every week. Unbelievable. Don't even get tipped. Come just for that. Come just for that. Come for the singing and dancing pastor. Stay for Elizabeth's cake. I remember there's a really lovely woman and who used to come years ago, and she Spanish Catholic lady. She's great, and she had a daughter who was in a toddler group. Terrifyingly, I went out kayaking with the guides the other day, and she's now taller than me, which is unbelievable. I was sort of staring at her and had to break my thing because this little girl who I used to dance in front of and used to jig around like this is now bigger than me and rowing boats down a river. But anyway, I remember this lady coming in one day. She said, "Oh, I'm getting my daughter baptized." I thought, "Oh, great, you know." She said, "Yeah, we've been to Israel. We got water from the Jordan. Brought a Coke bowl full of water from the Jordan to get her baptized. He christened in a Catholic church with, and it was filthy. I mean, filthy. And I'm sort of standing there looking at her. She's come to tell me because I'm the pastor, right? So I'm supposed to go, "Oh yeah, you know, water from the Jordan. It's probably holier than other water." And I'm actually thinking, There's quite a lot of mud in that water. Right? You shake it up and all you can see is it's brown, right? But if you just stand there and it's still, for even 5 minutes, all the mud and the dirt floats to the bottom and you're left with something that's actually clear. There are scientists who say that actually that's a really good way to clean water. They're working on different strategies for how to clean water, that you put grit and stuff in it, shake it, and it pulls the infirmities down. You just let it stand still. And when it stands still, you can start to see. So how do we do that in practice? Well, I'm going to say there are 3 steps. First, turn off. You can begin to get yourselves off the addiction to distraction by turning stuff off and making space for quiet during the day. Right? So don't bake with the radio on for 5 minutes. I'm not saying never listen to the radio. I love the radio. I always have Jazz FM on if I'm baking. It's great. But we can start to turn stuff off and make space. Turn the TV off. Just start to put your phone in a box. I actually have a box in my house that someone made for me years ago. And I stick my phone in it for an hour at a time, so it's not near me. It's a kind of fasting. It breaks, we're going to think about fasting in a few weeks' time, but part of the point of fasting is it breaks the hold of stuff over you. Second, tune in. Solitude isn't just the absence of distraction, it's actually changing our focus to God. That's why that psalm talks about, the Greek words have the idea of lifting your soul to God. Tune in. How do you tune in? That is the hardest question. There are some really great books on this. I'm going to recommend them. I found them profoundly helpful. The first, and by far the most accessible, is this one. This is Ruth Haley Barton's An Invitation to Solitude and Silence. I would go as far as saying, if you buy one book this year, read this book. Apart from the Bible. I'm contractually obliged to say that. If you read one book this year, apart from the Bible, read An Invitation to Solitude and Silence. It is very practical, very accessible, and very helpful. Get that on Amazon. I find that in the silence, and actually there's a lot of research on this by monks for years, thousands of years. The problem with being quiet is that my mind wanders, right? So I'm sitting there being silent, and instead of focusing on God and contemplating Him, I'm sitting there and I'm just going to sit down and be quiet, Lord. I want to focus on you. And within 5 seconds, I'm like, I think Antonio Conte should play a 3-man midfield because then we'd have more control. Because it just doesn't make sense. We're getting overloaded every week. I think, no, I shouldn't think about that. I want to think about Jesus. Sit there. But then it would mean sacrificing a striker. So then I think, no, it's not spiritual. Lord, I want to be focused on you. Just want all the distractions to go. Did I leave the kettle on? No. Better go and check. Right, and I'm done. Right? You want something to bind your thoughts, right? The way to get over that is to give your thoughts something to think about. So the Eastern Orthodox developed this really great thing called the Jesus Prayer, where they basically take a short prayer to Jesus and they just repeat it. And it's a way of binding your thoughts to the name of Christ. And they use one of these. You might see me walking around with one of these. This is a prayer rope. It's just made up of 100 knots. And I literally just hold it and work it through my fingers while I'm praying. And it has the effect of keeping me focused. That's all it is. It's an aid to concentration. Get this book. It helps. So, turn off, tune in, take note. That's the final thing about silence. Do you speak too much? Do I? Are you just generating noise in the world? Do your words carry weight? Jesus said, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. And I used to sit there and read that and think, well, what on earth else might they mean? And then I grew up and I realised a lot of the time they don't really mean that, do they? It's partly about honesty. But it's also partly about just saying what you mean. meaning what you say, and allowing your words to be thought through and kind. So just try and notice them for a week. Consciously, how am I speaking? If you put this into action every day, then over time you'll start to see a change and increasing wisdom and peace. Solitude and silence are a way of reconnecting with God and finding peace and healing for our fractured souls.